Okay, Wynn Schwartz, we all know him. He's presented many times. We're delighted to have him again. Wynn is a clinical and experimental psychologist and research psychoanalyst in the faculty of Harvard University. He's on the editorial board of the American Journal of Psychotherapy and Professional Psychology, Research Practice, and he's also the author of Descriptive Psychology and the Person Concept. He maintains a psychotherapy supervision and consultation practice in Boston. Wynn has presented on a variety of topics at this conference over the years, and we're delighted to have him again.
Wynn, you can now share again.
Okay, if I hit share, let's just see what happens, because it's this is not the slide I actually wanted to begin with, but let me just see about there we go. If not, I don't see you guys, so let me get rid of the slide. I don't need the slide now. Is there still a slide up there?
No,
No,
Okay, that's fine. There is this odd vision of me in the screen with a delayed action as I move my hand, which is gonna weird me out more than I'm already weirded out today. Well, I've got a phone turned backwards and off because given especially the topic of that I unfortunately chose. I'm waiting to hear about whether somebody at Mass General made it through the night and what that's going to mean for their family. So the topic that I had initially decided to present was the title I chose was Sitting Shiva, and with the news of Keith's passing, it feels particularly unfortunately germane. It's a side note. As I was trying to put together what I wanted to do here, I was reading one of a novelist I've been turning to quite frequently in the last couple of years as a way to escape the wonderfulness of the general world around. Mick Herron in his novel Nobody Walks, where an older character is referring to one of the younger characters in the story and saying that she was young enough to believe words like closure had meaning. And this particular aging affinity group, that's part of the reason that I've put together this topic, by this point recognizes some of the illusions of closure. And as I looked at the disjointed aspects of what I wanted to put together here, what I've selected is a series of somewhat related reminders that may serve a particular purpose, which is, well, Sitting Shiva. Initially, I had thought I would be sitting in this room with you guys. It was the plan to my wife and I to go to Colorado for this period before then later on going to Martha's Vineyard and spending a few weeks there fishing. But the idea of being in contact, that feeling of being in the room together, is an essential feature of at least the Jewish mourning ritual of sharing, getting together, first degree relatives as a rule for 7 days, and mourning through reflection. And but a member of my family, a very important family member, one of my two dogs, Hart, better known as Penutti, developed about 3 months ago an acute kidney failure, and we thought that he was gone. 8 days in a very good veterinary hospital. He was revived enough that, the question is bringing him home, which we did. And but he wasn't eating. He hadn't been eating. He was, just sort of barely making it. And the idea was we would take him home and we would, do the infusions that would be necessary pretty much for the rest of his life. And but he still wasn't eating much. And was sitting with a roast beef sandwich and I was eating it, and he was looking at me sort of in a numb state, but looking with his eyes a little sparkly. So I, gave him a piece of it, and he almost took a finger off, started eating. And from that, my wife figured out with me some what looked like a good diet, and the dog started eating, and returned to his ordinary bratty. He's a Dachshund Feist, which is a southern version of Rat Terrier mix. So he has the most. He's been training us for 14 years how to, properly behave in his presence. And he's a brother who is, a little younger. He's 12-year-old, and so the brother, of course, is looking over. Who was very upset when Hart was in the hospital because he needs his brother. Noticing the food, and then made it very clear through some gestures as he looked over at the food and then looked down at the rug. Or do you want me peeing on that? So he profited from that too. So, a good deal of our day now involves putting together, well, my wife's job, putting together a very elaborate but very tasty meal that I'd be very happy to eat and have at times. And then the evenings involve both of us doing an infusion, which it's just important that we're together and doing this. And that's what we're going to do probably for the duration of this dog's being with us. But I still can go to Martha's Vineyard because he can come there with us, and it's close enough. So with that in mind, that dog story, what I wanted to talk about is a theme that in some ways in my mind began operating. I don't remember exactly what it was, but the last time we were in Pensacola as a group, which was many years ago, we're on a sailboat, and it's just this beautiful sail around the bay. And I looked around and I mentioned to somebody on the boat, that this is a gathering. This is what is becoming an aging affinity group.
That
And
was
we,
me.
and that was 20 years ago, at least. You know, so I look at because even then the age stratification was becoming apparent, and now it's quite apparent. In a traditional Shiva, meeting, you've got the first degree relatives. So you have. So who are our first degree relatives? Well, many of us trained directly with Peter Osorio. We're, so to speak, the children of that, but it's a children that has produced very few grandchildren. There's not been much intellectual transmission. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with a variety of factors. One of the probably most basic one being the fact that it was a PhD program in clinical psychology, which is to say that most people do not become teachers, and that for intellectual transmission in a subject matter like psychology or philosophy, which I know actually a little more about its transmission, you got to have PhDs who are training PhDs, teachers who are training teachers. And this community produced very, very few of those sorts. So I wanted to talk about basically two themes here. When one's sitting around in this period of mourning, there's the job is to share remembrances, to reflect on the significance of a life, the significance of a set of relationships. And there are two themes that have come to mind here. One is the relationship of this group And the unlikely and how unlikely it is that as a community will persist as an ongoing cohesive community with its intellectual offspring joining it much longer. I hope I'm wrong. And I've got some reasons to doubt some of what I'm about to say. But I'm actually more concerned about what this community has possessed, what it's held dear, what it's worked on, which is the subject matter. And it's a subject matter that is what I want to mostly talk about. Initially, what I had in mind was a kind of forensic autopsy, since I believe an intellectual injustice has occurred that needs correction, and that this entire package of descriptive psychologists and the people that taught us, the person that taught us, the groups of us that have held this information so near, have had a role in its restriction, a role that needs correction, as has the nature of the subject matter itself. A subject matter that I think ordinarily would have found an appropriate place in a philosophy department, where subject matters like this generally reside under the banner of analytic and moral philosophy. But instead, it's being taught as an extraordinarily useful set of tools for us. Now, I'm much less concerned about how, when I'm in my original sense of what I wanted to do, less concerned, or more hopeful. And let me give you just the basic reasons are that, well, one, Ned's extraordinary curating of our literature and its place in a website, a very antiquated website that is in utter need of a major aesthetic operation, and a major, but the content's there. And the work that I think Ned and a few others have gone into to curate, assemble, to preserve that in its form, is one of the lifesavers. And it's an extraordinary resource. Another very recent is Ray Bergner's extraordinary piece in a current American Psychologist, a piece about the value of conceptual clarity. I think that piece alone opens doors, as has a tremendous amount of Ray's work. T has provided, I think, what could also be an important corrective, one that I talked about yesterday as a corrective, because of the way most of us were educated about descriptive psychology. In psychology, of course, it was not what it was. Exactly. Could have been descriptive anthropology, descriptive, just which I think one of these, well, we tend to call it descriptive, was taught as if it was sui generis in many ways, as if it came full born out of Pete's head. And he would occasionally provide correctives about that, but he didn't work too hard at it. Because I think he recognized both the uniqueness of what he was doing and the isolation with which he felt he was doing it within. I think the isolation that he felt he was doing it within may be within psychology departments, but actually ignored the broader intellectual turmoil that was begging and providing versions of such a subject matter during that same historical period. None is elegant, none is cohesive, none is coherent. Oh, and then I got a royalty check today from my text, which I always find somewhat encouraging. It means it's in lots of libraries. It means somebody's paying for, chapters or whatever through Elsevier's exploitive model. I'm less concerned. There's stuff there. But I think what I'm going to just come back to is that what our fundamental mission should be is the library, is establishing librarian status, is to create access. And I'm going to say a little bit about what I think that essential material is in a bit. But I think we're nearing an ending of sorts, and an ending that requires a kind of rebirth or renewal, or memorial, an access, a library. So let me just provide some reminders, which is that a person's world reflects the relationships that span their life. And that the important events that mark relational changes and endings in particular, affect the memory and significance of that history. And in this manner, relationships never really end. Instead, endings change the relationship's significance and range of enactments. We remember, sometimes we're haunted by. We can look up, sometimes they're, lost but then later found. They may exist in our imaginings. But they remain, whether they're active or not, as a behavior potential. I think it's our job to preserve and enhance that behavior potential of the subject matter, in particular, the behavior potential that the person concept facilitates in a way that we're not seeing anywhere else in the intellectual world. And as a moderate scholar in that area, I don't know anything like it. And I spent a fair amount of time looking. The other theme, which was, the one that I thought I was going to spend more time talking about, but hopefully less, is that acquiring insight in new concepts changes a person's perspective. Death, the parting of ways, and insightful conceptualizations invite a revisiting that can instigate a reformulation of a person's world. As a psychoanalyst, I'm quite familiar with our various mostly misleading theories about mourning and identification with the lost object, but the way in which we take on the characteristics in some fashion, often, of those things that we most value when they're not there in front of us, or when we can't, embrace them, when they're not something that we can simply hold, but we have to feel within ourselves. Loss, the frustration of loss, the developing of competence around what is needed because of what's been lost, sometimes leads to a growth and identification within oneself. I think many of us have experienced versions of that with our mentors, our teachers. There's lots of ways that leave taking. Breakups, psychotherapeutic terminations can affirm or degrade the significance of what's remembered. Similarly, embracing new and novel concepts can change the meaning of past traumas and ones still underway. With those themes in mind, which is why originally I was going to talk a lot about Freud's Nachträglichkeit and Amanda Fricker's concept of epistemic injustice, because of what they may elucidate. And so let me just say just a few brief words about that, mainly because I got notes about it, because, one of Freud's, most useful recognitions, that is rarely put front and center in his writings, the French have made more use of it through Lacan, is Nachträglichkeit. The French translated into afterwardness, which then moves into delayed action into English. But it's a delayed reaction or response. It's a delayed experience of trauma. It's a remembering and reappraising the past as significantly different than the past itself was experienced. Freud thought about this when he looked at the notion, when he developed the various models of the Oedipus complex and then of adolescence, in which one's emerging sexuality then would lead to a reevaluating, a rememorizing of earlier experiencing, and in fact, maybe a traumatizing of earlier experience that wasn't experienced in traumatic ways to begin with. But that the novelty, the new experiences of the body, the new ways of looking at things may provide a way of reflecting on one's history or feeling one's history in a way that one doesn't ordinarily feel. Well, there's a current version of this that is of considerable significance in moral philosophy. And probably the best representative of this is the philosopher Amanda Fricker, an Oxford DPhil. Currently, she's the Julius Silver Chair of Philosophy at NYU. who developed the concept, which probably the best known text is Epistemic Injustice, Power and the Ethics of Knowing, came out in 2007. She talked about what she called hermeneutical injustice. And that occurs when someone's experiences aren't well understood by themselves. Now, a side note, it's this concept that's going to utterly fuel the Me Too movement, which you think you'll recognize. It's what happens when people are not able to give voice to their own experience. They know the experience first person. They've been troubled by it, but they don't have a coherent way of transmitting it, clarifying it, finding community with it. They can't use verbal behavior in its ordinary sense because they lack concepts that provide the specificity to fit what they are otherwise trying to articulate. It's not yet, they don't have shared social practices that involve verbal behavior. Now, when Fricker's writing about this, she's writing about it from a period of feminist theory. And she's pointing to privileged communities in scholarship and journalism that have historically excluded the people who actually are experiencing and needing the concepts for understanding themselves. That the scholarship, the communities that actually possess this knowledge have not provided it to people who are most in need of these concepts. Now, maybe you see where I'm going, which is this is why I think we're somewhat guilty of an epistemic injustice in regard to our subject matter, broadly speaking. So let me say a bit more about that. In the 1960s, after a long gestation that came out of the clearly recognized intellectual bankruptcy of the major personality theories and of the foundations of most of the behavioral sciences, at least the reductionistic and mechanistic metaphors that were root metaphors that were so prevalent. Amongst the intellectual communities in the humanities, and amongst a lot of personality theorists themselves, and pretty broadly understood in what was emerging in the philosophy of psychology, the post-Wittgensteinian philosophies and philosophers, the intellectual bankruptcy of personality theory as practiced in psychology was becoming quite apparent, in which the various major theories looked more like warring theologies than intellectually coherent statements that could exchange. And in part it came because they tended to rise out of what Stephen Pepper called root metaphors, very basic ways of beginning to build a world from the bottom up, in most cases, except for formalism and contextualism. But metaphors that were used to structure an entire way of thinking about people that were not properly appreciated by the practitioners, who were instead locked in a Procrustean bed about what they thought science needed to be. The classic place this has been studied has been in Freud, where he was dealing with basically two general ways of making sense of the world. One being the mechanistic, the organic and mechanistic vision of Helmholtz, in which every explanation to be sensible has to be reducible to a chemical, electrical, or physical force. A force of attraction or repulsion, or as the dictum of Helmholtz went, something of equal dignity. In fact, this became a banner that was posted on some of the wall scribings above one of the Helmholtz institutes. So he did that. He tried to make a mechanical theory, an organic and mechanical theory, and failed, and knew he failed. At the same time, he's trying to write stories about people, narratives about deliberation, intentionality. He's on the one hand, he's a student of Helmholtz, and on the other, he's a student of Brentano. Brentano, it was when he thought he was going to be a law student, as was some of the founder of phenomenology, maybe at the same time. And Brentano, as you know, was looking at the notion of intentionality as a fundamental feature of the psychical. So Freud told stories about the intent, the meaning, the significance of action, the through lines that connected infancy through adulthood, but tried to make it mechanical, reductionistic, deterministic, and knew it didn't work, while trying to develop a treatment of liberation, of freedom of choice as the therapeutic goal to enhance behavior potential. It didn't work conceptually because of the distinction. So that was a history of sorts, a history that continued to contaminate theory through the 60s and still does. Although at the same time, we began to see practitioners in my particular field, psychoanalysis, Roy Schaefer and George Klein being probably the best examples of people who had made careful studies of Wittgenstein and of phenomenology, and just recognized the dilemma of what they were doing and began to rework the entire structure of the theory as essentially a theory of the nature of intentionality, given the particular kind of organism that we are. So pushes for the reconstruction in the 60s, recognizing this bankruptcy, came from contemporary analytic, linguistic, and ordinary language philosophers in the West broadly, and continental existential and phenomenologists in Europe. And those particular personality theorists that just recognized something was wrong. That was the historical opportunity that Osorio was writing within, fully informed about these other issues and writers. So there was an historical opportunity ripe for engagement in which a top-down approach was beginning to emerge, in which one would start with the recognition of what people actually do, what's required for our systems of legality and, criminality and tort, for contract, for the whole notion of accountability, for I, thou, for an understanding of the subjectivity and the relational needs of belonging. Something essential about community that involved the requirement to respect deliberate, cognizant, and non-cognizant aspects of intentionality, and especially the significance of action in order to make sense of the world in the lives of humans. Now, notice I said humans, and they also, the writers were talking about the vertebrates in general, and not persons. Osorio wrote about the concept of persons, and not as an organism, but wrote about persons in a manner that, may be part of the probably apocryphal question about whether NASA really did have a contract out about answering the question, if green gas on the moon speaks to an astronaut, how do we know whether or not it's a person? And Osorio built a scaffolding that could be used to address that question. So let me remind you, and this is just, something I celebrate. Let me remind you about what we have that I think is something that we have closely guarded. I think maybe Ray described Osorio as the most important psychologist that nobody's ever heard of. Descriptive psychology was intentionally developed to provide full access to the essential distinctions via the most inclusive and complex concept in the universe. Given that every idea is somebody's idea, the person, the actionable concept that needs to be respected to reconstruct an authentic behavioral science. But it remained hiding and not in plain sight. the crime, if you will, the injustice is that we've been in possession of conceptual tools that can provide corrective feedback. And these days, a lot of it would be tinkering feedback because a lot of these other scaffoldings are being out there. A person who's become a very dear friend of mine, Michael Kabovi, has been working. In fact, it's interesting to hear the concepts of talking about metaphor today, because the book that he's putting together right now with a philosopher at Columbia is on elucidation as a generalized concept for, and it's a very beautiful kind of set of concepts that he's working on. There are descriptive psychologies or versions of these things hanging out everywhere. But they're not as good as what you guys have in your pockets. They're not as elegant, they're not as complete. So we've had tools that would have provided corrective feedback that could speak to the questions that so vital to others, but they've not been offered up in part. And so in terms of my indictment, there's a number of themes that just sort of emerge. One is that this community, this subject matter has, with the exception of Tony Putman's work, has been a subject matter that's been very resistant to the assimilation of additional concepts or ideas. It's been very hard to introduce things. In fact, it's led to some fairly heated exchanges some years back. It wasn't my expression, it was C.J. Stone. So if you're in the room, I'm gonna blame him for describing the distinction between what he called the pietists and descriptive psychology. And the pietists being the people that basically, if it's not in the Talmud, if it's not in the book, if it's not there already, then it's not descriptive psychology. In contrast to recognizing the nature of the enterprise and its utter dependence, given the way it's structured, on being able to assimilate and accommodate things that fit, as long as those things don't negate factors that are essential for the person concept. In fact, things that would expand it, and it's been deliberately designed as an expanding open system. So this has been a difficult place to bring new stuff in, which is also a conservative thing, which has its important benefits. It's a good way for quality control. I think we were really careful about that. And it's a community that I think that Ned Kirsch can clearly describe, that was negligent and neglected and at times hostile to embodiment concerns. The first issue of the Advances has an Osorio chapter on the concept of embodiment. Even yesterday, there was a question was raised about status, about what does this mean about, their biological terms. Well, a person's anatomy, their body, their physical state, it's a feature of their status. We neglected those things. And in neglecting those things, we neglected at times to pay as close attention as we might have to the empirical developmental recognitions that are important in the actual lives of humans as persons. We neglected the recognition of the meaning of being a particular kind of vertebrate. We also had a kind of disdain for the useful place of theory, largely because our subject matter is not a theory, but it's a useful tool for theories. So let me continue just a bit by telling you what we can't lose. And damn it, we really shouldn't. And we've got ways not to. And let me just, if I can get this up here again, let's see. I'm trying to share, and I'll try not to mess this up. Good luck on that. Without showing my tax returns at the same time. Okay. person concept. Gotta move all this stuff and then, I've been doing this for years and I still have, every time I remember how to do this, I have to forget another concept. So I'm being, okay. Is it up on the screen now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so let me just, remind you of what we have. And I'm gonna be selective about it. Let me tell you what I think is from my perspective, what we possess that is not, that there's nothing else like it with its degree of elegance, with its generative possibilities, with its transformative possibilities. There's the person concept, which I think is the central subject matter. And then there's central distinctions, methods, formulas, and reminders that there's methodologies that have come out of this that already exist elsewhere, but that have been beautifully described, I think, in our literature. It starts though with some clarity about the distinction between the conceptual, the empirical, and the theoretical. So let me just quickly remind you, concepts are neither true nor false. They're actionable. They're model, they're a reminder of a certain kind of action. They correspond linguistically to a way of representing in a speech act, some social practice. Concepts are, in information theory terms and Gregory Bateson's terms, differences that make a difference. And the difference that they make in differences is that you can act on them. They're a tool. And as Wittgenstein points out, they're an irregular tool, and that allows the irregularities in forms of grammar to get at the full set of distinctions that can be acted upon. There's concepts. And concepts in the, I don't know if this is showing up, in the world model, in the distinction between the reality and real world distinction that Osorio develops, reality being the full set of the full status, the full set of distinctions. They're a guide to possibilities, which lead to the potential for invention, and they're going to correspond to the range of things that we can do. So you have a kind of concepts. You've got the concept of the individual person who can engage in deliberate action and can paradigmatically speak about it as they engage in a world. But that doesn't tell us anything, as I think T pointed out yesterday, about what actually flows to the river. For that, you need to look. You need to look closer. Wittgenstein pointed out an uncertainty. I can't prove that there's one hand in front of me. That's not subject to the issue of proof. I can ask if you have a reason to doubt it. And if you do, I can all say, just look closer. There's the observational. But then we come to the theoretical. If your conceptual map, if your person concept is set up as an attempt to provide a framework for looking at the full state of what a human, a non-human, a person can engage in, then, but what are the particulars, historical particulars? For those, we end up acting like the old natural historians. We go out in the world and look. What side of the tree is the moss actually growing on? How long does it take to grow up and get pregnant? What is a gestation period? How do you go about learning to speak? There's the empirical. You have to go out and look and see and record systematically. And then there's theory. And the role of theory is to indicate out of the full range of possibilities why we only observe certain patterns of them. The real world is one that we come to understand outside of the reality concepts its realness, so to speak, is in some ways the observer and the theoretician's job to articulate why it's that pattern and not the full range of other patterns. And from that, we understand why it's one way and not another way. And then we have methodologies that may involve prediction or understanding or statistical analysis or what have you, to help verify, to vindicate, to use Osorio's term, for these sorts of theories. That our scientific methodologies don't never prove anything. What they do instead is they vindicate, they validate the usefulness of talking one way rather than another. So we have those distinctions. We've got some particular methodologies that actually show up in other forms. They show up in the law, for example, the paradigm case formulation. We have a paradigm case formulation, which is a top-down model in which you find something that everybody agrees on, that's indubitable, that if there was, God help me, if there's ever such a case, it's this. You start with an area of such agreement that you can then understand by, and then do a parametric analysis of it, so that you can then see from reducing elements where a legitimate argument occurs. What's a family? What's a chair? The abortion person debate is one that can be largely argued on amongst, if we start with the paradigmatic case of a person being one able to engage in deliberate action in a dramaturgical fashion, then we can start taking out elements of that. Do we still agree this is a person? But at least in the reduction of the full case, we can begin to see where we agree or disagree. The paradigm case formulation allows us to begin with a common ground. And there's some very specific ways of going about building that, which I think Osorio has beautifully illustrated in the behavior of persons and elsewhere. We have parametric analyses, which you're all familiar with from plane geometry and solid geometry, the axes under which you can show how one thing is the same or different from any other thing within a certain category. We have those tools, very useful. We have some that are more specifically tied to the intentional action formats. The judgment diagrams, which allow us to get at the significances of weighted motivation as personal characteristics, coupled with the competence to engage with those characteristics as represented within the actor, given the actor's circumstances, which allows us to look at motivational hierarchies and significances, and mapping those over time as certain significances show up as implemented the same way differently. To use a problematic term, through lines become observable as the pattern, as the dramaturgical pattern, based on the significances that are chosen, the implementations that are chosen of what a person finds intrinsically significant.
When I want to interrupt, let you know you have about 15 minutes left.
Good, because I'm pretty close to the end. We have the relationship formulas. Another way to work at the real experiences of why it is we do one thing rather than another, and whether in the unless clauses. We're now moving into the realm of contract, of that kind of a logic, but one that actually follows from the nature of how people really behave. And the unless clauses move directly from the parameters of intentional action, of ways in which behavior can change from what it's expected to something that wouldn't be expected. The state of affairs system that allows us to construct or deconstruct. The status and the status dynamic maxims, which I'll end with. The status, the n-dimensional, the niche, the n-dimensional, Hutchinson's notion of the n-dimensional hypervolume that includes all facts and possible facts relevant to an organism during that organism's lifespan, limited in Hutchinson's 55 theory by the speed of light as all possible influences, although some quantum mechanists would add some new features, only a few of which are relevant. The niche, your place, the place that includes the place of this, of what's in here, and of us, and of our world. Now, I just want to quickly remind us and I'll end with this. But something else that we have, frankly, I think the most beautiful book that we have in our library is Place, which I think reads as a fierce and elegant prose poem, without a wasted word. It's one of those elegant pieces of writing I know. I know it looks a bit like the Tractatus. It looks a bit like the Investigations. It's written in the form that's clearer, closer to what you see in the Tractatus. It's beautiful. Let me remind you of the ones that most of us were first taught, the 9. You can use this in a class of undergraduates, and suddenly people start to build models, build things that make sense for them. The first, a person takes that things are as they seem, unless they have reason to think otherwise. The second, if a person recognizes an opportunity to get something they want, they have a reason to try to get it. They may have reasons not to try to get it. If a person has a reason to do something, they will do it unless they have a stronger reason not to. Motivational hierarchy. If a person has 2 reasons to do X, they have a stronger reason for doing X than if they only had one of these reasons. The multiplicity of motivation. One of the most valuable ones for talking about pathology and actual behavior. If a situation calls for a person to do something they can't do, they will do something they can do. Which is to say, something that, given the other maxims, is of personal significance that, to use a different point, from their perspective, helps them maintain or improve their status, their place. A person acquires facts by observation and thought. The 7th, person acquires concepts and skills by practice and experience in some of the social practices that involve the use of the concept and the exercise of the skill. The openings for developmental theory. But the developmental theory needs empirical observations about how these damn things grow. 8, if a person has a given personal characteristic, they acquired it, and one of the ways it can be acquired by having a prior capacity and an appropriate intervening history. As we all well know, it ain't a level playing field. But that doesn't mean that we can't make just moves to make the field leveler. And then the 9th one, which I'll leave us with, is that given the relevant competence, behavior goes right if it doesn't go wrong in one of the ways it can go wrong. One of the ways our precious object, our subject matter, can go wrong is if in the classical biological terms, it hasn't been provided fitness, which is the ability to be reproduced by people who can reproduce it. The legacy issue. This community needs a legacy. It needs a well-curated library. It needs a lot more Ray Bergners. So, thank you. There we go.
Stop share. Thank you.
Jokes, riddles, brain teasers?
Comments, questions?
Marty Smith.
Marty Smith?
I have, oh, sorry.
Marty, you're on mute.
Martin, you're on mute. Okay.
Yes, I am no longer on mute, I assume.
No.
Right.
I want to thank Wynn for a very, very comprehensive, wonderful explication of so many things. And I also want to say it is very touching in terms of what you're going through with a family member. And it was a very impressive and very full and very complete explication of the problem, and also of the treasure that you have in the library and will be in the library. I'm sort of speaking as an outsider. And so I'll just comment from the perspective of an outsider. When I was in graduate school, so my cohort, give or take a couple years, Ray was a couple years ahead of me. CJ was a year behind me. The people who were drawn to Osorio were very, very, very intellectual and very, very, very intellectually powerful. My experience has been, and I don't know how this pertains in a way in terms of getting the information to more people who could assimilate the information that you all have. One of the most important things in my training, I'm psychoanalytically, I don't know if I would even call that, but what grabbed me as a way of understanding things was psychoanalytic concepts. And so the first, I was looking for someone who understood what was going on and could help me understand what was going on as a therapist. And I was probably 4 years into my training, and I ran into an extraordinary supervisor who happened to be a very, very skilled analyst. And he never, and then I did some postdoc in psychoanalytic psychotherapy and whatever. But this supervisor, and then there was another one much later in my career, somewhat later in my career after I had graduated and was practicing and all of that. This supervisor he spoke in totally plain English. He never used a jargon term. He never used, we were reading these articles, these complexities and these terms I'd never heard of and trying to figure out what they were and all of that, and the valences and the countervalences and interjects and whatever. This guy never used anything but plain English to explain what was going on. He could put it into plain English, and it was amazing. It opened vistas. It opened all sorts of action potentials, and I was able to and he was enormously sought after. It sunk in, and we used it. And later on, I had a very, very powerful supervisor who was a highfalutin, well-known, highly respected, very, very senior training analyst who consulted.
Marty, can I interrupt for 1 second? I'm a little bit concerned about time.
I'm so sorry. He also never used a single piece of jargon. It was all in plain English. It was all very, very comprehensible. So my point is there a way, without losing the brilliance of Osorio and all that goes into that, how can you communicate it? Like when Ray presents a case, it's clear, and it's clear what's going on. When CJ talks about what he does with training people in group community relations, whatever, it's very clear what's going on. I don't hear a lot of jargon. I don't hear a lot of things that people would say, what's going on? I can't get into this. This doesn't pertain to me. It's very clear, and it comes through. So is there a way in terms of sharing the wealth of Osorio that can be communicated to people in plain English.
If I could just make a brief comment about that, which is,
Yeah,
there's a reason why I think it's been so useful to us as practitioners, which is, using your natural language. If you're a competent person in a world of persons, you already know all the distinctions. Occasionally you need to get some special ones, but most of those exist somewhere within our vocabularies because they show up in our social practice, they show up in our actions. The difficulty is the distinction between being able to act. And I think what Osorio provided is a freedom. This is what status dynamic psychotherapies are about, the freedom to fully act as a person in a world of persons in which you're trying to help something change in a negotiated fashion or a not negotiated fashion, if that should be your, your method. But it's permission. It's the eligibility to make use of what you already know. The dilemma is that we are talking about a highly refined, philosophically coherent system of systems. And there's a reason why philosophy departments that train philosophers, which is only about a half dozen of them on the planet, at least in the English-speaking world, involve people with a very particular intellectual bent, which is to be essentially struggling with concepts as concepts. And I think that is part of the problem, which is that our subject matter is utterly conceptual, but it opens the door for everything else. And that's why I think the value of a well-stocked, coherent library is important, is to maintain that scaffolding for the people that have some use of it.
and maybe to communicate the concepts also to people who don't have the jargon, if there's a way to do that. I'll be quiet. I'm done. Let other people talk.
Well, in the interest of time, which I am concerned about, Walter, go ahead and make your comment. And you're muted right now, I think. No, you're not. Okay, go ahead.
Doing, that was lovely, and you talked a good bit about how we went wrong with respect to not passing this kind of this wealth on to others. And it's something I've thought about a fair amount. And I just wanted to make a couple of comments on that. Some of the reasons for it, I think, are fairly mundane. And in the mid-70s, I was at the Mass General. At that time, we were talking, and Ray was writing about status dynamic therapy. At the same time, Aaron Beck discovered that he made some comment to some patient and that it made a difference on his mood. And he started doing research on it and publishing that research, empirical data. And he showed how that made a difference. And he did more empirical research. And the difference there, or the critical difference there, is akin to what Ray described when he talks to his classes. He makes a comment about that there's going to be some empirical assertion, and the class looks up. He talks about a conceptual framework. They keep focused on their phones. And the empirical data, for example, engages actors and engages the community out there as actors, not just as observer critics. And so that's one area where we got behind the 8 ball. Another one is that we did not engage in arguments, in dialogues with others. It would have been very nice if, whatever, Pete had been in panels or whatever, where there was arguments out there. So dialogues, or better yet, arguments. again, you're enlisting actors, not just observer critics.
A
Let's see what
side
else.
note, I think part of the lore is that in Pete's first 3 or 4 years, he tried to do that and met, except maybe with people like Lyle Bourne, a pretty hostile, response to the to what looked like a negation. I mean, that's why they wrote this paper on saying no. I mean, if you recall, you may have recalled like trying to say something and sort of going no. Doing that with your senior peers doesn't usually work that well.
Well, I understand, but nonetheless, but with peers that are parallel, it might work beautifully because you could establish an argument.
That's
And
Keith.
so
That was Keith.
Oh, okay. There you go.
Let me
Anyway.
interrupt for a second, because I guess I need to know what people want to do in terms of time. I have a feeling we could talk all afternoon about this, but we need to keep some kind of limit. So do people want to add another 10 minutes, or we feel like we need to stop right now?
Actually, another 10 or 15 minutes.
Remember, limits have to be preserved because limits have to be preserved.
Yeah, and we gotta be back here at 5 o'clock for
Business
a
meeting.
business meeting that's really important, so. Should we say 10 minutes and then we're gonna cut it off? So, Wynn, keep that in mind when you respond to everybody. And Walter, you wanna finish up, because we have 2 other hands that I see up at least, so David Bender and Errol. So go ahead and finish up, Walter.
Anyway, I know about, but I have not read Ray's article coming out in the American Psychologist. But it's a kind of follow-up that would be nice to have in setting up dialogues with others, or better yet, arguments. And in conveying what difference does this make? Because that's one of the difficult things to get across and to establish. But again, it's engaging others as actors. Okay, I'll leave it there. By the way, if we could get a publicist, that would even be better. Go ahead.
Okay, David Bender, I think you were next.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
All right. I have this strange sort of feeling that Wynn has somehow had an ear to the board meetings that we've had for this past year.
Did you look under the chair?
I'm not that paranoid, but maybe I should have. We can continue this, and we plan and hope that you will continue the energy that you have at the board meeting this evening. So plan on it, okay? All of you plan on it. We need your help, and we need more than what Wynn thinks and what Walter thinks and what we coulda, shoulda, woulda done. We need to ask and answer the question, what do we do now? And you're all responsible for that, and I'll hold you to it. So I look forward to your participation this evening.
The board does have a publicist.
The board does have a publicist.
Has a
Okay,
publicist.
okay, Errol?
Hi, I just wanted to say that one thing that had occurred to me during actually Ray's presentation the other morning was that with regards to the question of implementation, that I think we can access other ways of talking about the same conceptually coherent framework, meaning, kind of we can find a way of communicating it in the other person's set of existing locutions and sort of mannerisms of speaking. But the one piece of that, which I think is an interest, you mentioned like riddles or sort of like kind of sticky areas, that occurred to me a while ago, was that in a sense cohesion, consistency, logical sort of translatability. These are all, at the same time as they're very important to us, they're not necessarily rules of natural law or anything. And in a way, they're kind of more like policies than they are like laws. So I was
intellectual. Wait, but Errol, there are the policies of the intellectual and academic community.
absolutely.
Information
And don't get me wrong, I'm talking about more like in terms of that the whoever we happen to be speaking to, because in other practices other than academic settings, they might not be the priority, and people might prioritize the ability to change one's tune really easily, or toe the line with what other kind of authorities that may be involved in the situation. That might be the value there. So I think part of what we also have to be open to and flexible about is this idea that we can hold the consistent models in mind, but sort of being able to sort of recenter ourselves and then find a nice connection back to what a given person is talking about. Like, for example, I often use a parallel with people where I describe the fact that at my late grandmother's house, she really would value table manners. And I would make this sort of almost like intellectual mistake of saying, well, table manners aren't that important to everybody. And, why, it's not like we have to do it at home. Why do we have to do it at grandma's house? And at the end of the day, the answer is because we were at grandma's house. Those were the rules at grandma's house. It wasn't because they're absolute, and they are debatable, but it's not debatable that that's the way things go at grandma's house. So I'm just floating that out there because I think it could be an interesting thing to have an ongoing conversation about, like, as we're sort of thinking about branching out with people, like, how do we interact with people who don't necessarily value the debate part, who don't necessarily value the discussion part?
Just a second, I need to address this because this is a key point. That's precisely the problem I'm describing. That's what we're doing, and we've done well anyway. The trouble is how to transmit a body of literature, as work. I'm raising an academic connection question. The reason why psychoanalysis has persisted is not the academic community of the university, except in some cases, but because of well-established institutes that promoted and maintained a literature and a continuity.
I am going to use my eligibility as a moderator to say we just have to stop it in respecting people's time. So when you got us going, and we'll keep going, and they're really important questions.
See you at the business meeting.
All right, see you all at the business meeting.
Adios.